Chris?
How you doing, Mr. Farley? Just was calling about Romans 7,
Uh-huh.
um, where Paul says there's no longer him that sinned, but sin that dwelled in him.
Yeah.
But as Christians, we walk through the day. We know we still sin sometimes, and
Yeah.
the Bible tells us that we shouldn't. So I'm kind of confused on that part.
Okay. Yeah. Chris, that's a great question. I mean, he's talking about source here, and I always have believed that Romans 7 is really about Paul before salvation. You could title this chapter, I Fought the Law and the Law Won, because this is his confrontation with law-based living. I mean, why would I say that? Well, he says he's fleshly. He says he's sold in bondage to sin. He says the law that I thought was going to give me life actually brought death. Okay, who would be a person who would think the law would bring them life? Well, that would be a devout Pharisee, not a Christian. Every Christian in their right mind knows that they don't get life from the law. So when he says the law that I thought would bring life actually brought death, he's talking about his story, his testimony as a devout Pharisee. He was fleshly. He was sold in bondage to sin, it says. Well, that's not a Christian. Christians aren't sold in bondage to sin. Romans 6 says if you've died, you've been freed from sin. So we as Christians are freed from sin. We're not sold in bondage to sin. We've been bought by God, bought with a price. And so you look at this passage and you see that he's basically saying, I discovered a principle in me. Verse 21, I find this principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. So if you interviewed every Pharisee who ever lived and said, hey, do you want to do good? They would say, oh, I wake up every day and I try to do good. I try to do my best. Well, what happens to you? Well, if they know what they're talking about, they're going to say, yeah, evil is present in me. I find this evil principle inside me. It's holding me captive. It's holding me hostage. It's no longer I who do it, but sin living in me. So if you get my drift here, Paul is telling his story. He's giving his testimony as a devout Pharisee living under the law. And what do you discover under the law? You discover that you're a slave of sin, that you're sold in bondage to sin, that you need rescuing. So at the end of the story, he says, who will rescue me? And the answer is Jesus Christ. How? Well, through salvation, of course. As Paul is crucified, buried, and raised, he dies to sin. He's freed from sin. He's no longer sold in bondage to sin. But to answer your question, he's basically telling his story of this parasite called sin that had totally enslaved him. So when he says it's no longer I who do it, but sin living in me, when he says that twice, it's no longer I, but sin. It's no longer me, but it's sin living in me. He's telling the story of his addiction to this power called sin and that he needed rescue. How did the rescue come? It came through new birth, through death, burial, and resurrection into Christ Jesus. So, yes, we Christians still sin. We still commit sins. But if you were to want to know about the source of those thoughts, you could truly say today, you know what? The reason I sin today is when I get duped, when I get deceived, when I get tricked, when I let a parasite control me, and it doesn't even have to. I've died to sin. I'm freed from sin's power. I don't have to say yes to sin. And if I could recognize that because I'm a new person at my core, that parasite that once enslaved me doesn't enslave me any longer. It's all bark and no bite. Yes, it has a persistent call. There's a temptation and an accusation there. But I don't have to believe it. I don't have to take it at face value. I don't have to own it and call it me. It's not me. There's a power at work that is not me. You are not the power of sin. You're a child of God. You can count yourself dead to sin and alive to God. So do Christians still commit sins? Yes, but only when they let that parasite called sin dominate them. So this passage is about the source. It's answering those questions like, where do the dirty thoughts come from? Where do the lustful thoughts come from? Well, they come from a power called sin. Adam fell and the whole world was enslaved by this power. Yet today we have real freedom in Jesus, and we don't have to give in to those nasty thoughts. We can set our minds on really great things in Jesus Christ. So, Chris, I hope that encourages you tonight, my friend. Please call us back anytime.